Hi, and welcome to my talk today. My name is Rachelle Vesey, and I'm Assistant Professor in Applied Linguistics and Discourse Studies at Carleton University. I wanted to start by thanking Monica for this generous invitation and for the flexibility to allow me to have a form of bilingual talk. So my slides are in French, and much of the content is in French, but I'm doing my presentation itself in English. When we meet, I will be happy to answer questions in French, but for the purposes of the recording, I'm recording this in English, which is my first language. So what I'll be presenting to you today is how my work contributes to the field of language planning and policy, and more specifically, looking at a discursive approach to language policy, so l'approche discursive, and how I've used this approach for my own work on language policy in the Canadian context. So I'm by no means the first or the only person to be looking at a discursive approach to language policy. There's, of course, a growing body of work looking at a discursive approach. So what I'll be doing here is trying to situate how a discursive approach, l'approche discursive, can contribute to work in language policy in very specific ways. So I'll first start by spelling out this discursive approach, then looking at text analysis, which is a major part of a discourse approach, but not the only part of a discursive approach. Looking at intertextuality in the policy cycle, and then looking at how the policy cycle relates to some contexts in the Canadian language policy context. And then I'll highlight some of the findings from a few studies that I have done to give you an idea of the kind of way that I have used this approach in my own research. Okay, so what is a discursive approach? Well, this really fits within a larger aim of a discursive turn in the social sciences. And with relation to language policy, it has to do with targeting the role of language and discourse in language policy. And although it might seem obvious that, of course, language and discourse have a role in language policy, earlier work didn't focus necessarily on how texts figured into the creation, the implementation, and the outcomes of language policy contexts. And so there was this role of discourse in helping to understand the subjectivity involved in the creation and perpetuation and evolution of language policy contexts. So early work in this drew on the work of Thomas Rosento. The more recent book by David Cassels-Johnson is, of course, relevant here. And then there is an edited collection by Elizabeth Barakos and Johnny Unger that also helps to formalize what a discursive approach to language policy can involve. So here, looking at a discursive approach involves text analysis, including such things as actual language policy texts, but texts also more generally about language policy, and also texts where we're looking at language practices relating to language policy outcomes or deliberations. So we're looking at not just text analysis, though, we're also looking at text analysis in its original context so that we can see the way that those texts emerge from particular social contexts. And this is really what it's about, not just text analysis, but situating text analysis within its social context. So to this end, the aim is looking at who are the authors of these texts. Where do they come from? How do they fit within a social context in terms of power and authority? Who are the intended authors of texts? You know, are we looking at language policy texts, or are we looking at interactions between particular individuals? Who is the intended audience? And then what structures of power allow for these texts to be produced in the first place and allow for people to have access to these texts or not. So what is it about these texts and how do they relate to language policy contexts is really at the heart of a discursive approach to language policy. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing mainly on looking at the text analysis, but with the aim of trying to show how it fits within wider context, where these texts figure within a language policy process or cycle. So analyzing texts, as I've already mentioned, can involve looking at actual policy texts. And there is this increasing recognition that these texts aren't sort of standalone, objective renditions of a situation, but rather they're the result or outcome of specific social processes, that they're situated within a historical context. And that really, the most critical thing here is perhaps the fact that they are open to interpretations from the public, and the public has its own specific interests and agendas that will be relevant to how a text is interpreted. So this is one starting point. So we're not just looking, though, at language policy texts. We're also looking at text about text. So when we look at text analysis within a discursive approach to language policy, it's also how people talk about the language policy context, because in various models of language policy, we should be aware that language policy doesn't just involve language management, but also language beliefs or attitudes or ideologies, as well as language practices. So being aware that something such as Bosky's model lets us recognize that we're not just looking at the policies or the management of the language situation itself. So we look at talk about language, or meta discourse, or discourse about discourse. We're looking at discourse about language. So comments such as, how is language working? What is it doing? What is its role? How should language be? What are we expecting language to do? And what purpose are we expecting it to serve for us? And then thinking about observations or assumptions about things like speech and accent. What are we reading into what speech and accent mean to us? So it's not that a language policy can exist without the social context, which makes it meaningful and possible to exist. We're trying to understand how talk about language can also contribute to a language policy context, such that a policy can be successful and implemented or not. So meta discourse is reinforced by beliefs about language or language ideologies. And I know another talk as part of this series has already introduced the notion of language ideologies, but just very briefly, I wanted to introduce it very much in line with the same kind of references to Annette Boudreau and Lise Dubois, whose work I admire greatly. And they have this wonderful definition of language ideologies, which has to do with beliefs about language that are so widely shared and held to be common sense that the origin of these beliefs about language comes to be forgotten altogether. So when we think about our talk about language, we talk about language in a specific way because of the beliefs that we have about language that underpin our social context. So looking at meta discourse, talk about talk as a site for discourse analysis is important, because we're recognizing the role of language ideologies, or these beliefs about language, and how these can help us to understand why a language policy emerged in the first place, right? Why was there this recognition of a so-called language problem that needed to be fixed, if we want to subscribe to that view? Or why is the language policy not working, or why does it need to evolve? And I'll come back to this a little bit when I refer to the policy cycle. So the important thing here is to recognize that we're not actually dealing with facts about language necessarily. I mean, we could be dealing with language facts, but when we're talking about meta discourse, what we're actually dealing with is the linguistic imagination. We're dealing with how we imagine things to be, and this imagination of how the world could be very different on the basis of linguistic changes that relate to social changes that are desired. So it's important to recognize that we're not dealing with a world of fact and fiction so much as we're dealing with shared imagination about how we think language can work in society in different ways, and how our beliefs about language relate very much to our beliefs about society. Now, there's lots of discourse theory that I could draw on here to sort of support these points. But ultimately, looking at text analysis and relating text to discourse is important, because understanding the relation between text and society relates very much to the relationship between texts themselves. So when we look at relationships between texts, we can consider that in terms of the level of grammar or lexis, the way that texts borrow from one another. But we can also look at the relationship between texts in terms of how texts dialogue with one another in a Bakhtinian sense, looking at diglossia and heteroglossia, dialogism and heteroglossia. So how texts draw on one another and ultimately serve as responses to one another, that they don't exist in isolation from one another, that they ultimately are interconnected. And this is really the reason why understanding the role of text within a language policy context is so important, because we understand that even if we're looking at a language policy text, that text doesn't exist in isolation from talk about policy, talk about language. These things are all connected. Even media discourse, the way that a language policy context is represented in the media, relates to how beliefs about language underpin these different instances, specific instances of text. And this is why the analysis of individual text can give us greater insight into the language policy context where policies work or don't, or need to be adjusted or evolve. So looking at text relating to language policy, we might want to think about these as the result of discourses about language that exist in society, discourses about language that come from political figures, from journalists, from pressure groups, lobbyists, these kinds of things, and how these texts result from and result in other texts. So comments from other political members, from journalists, from pressure groups and lobbyists, from everyday people. So one example that I wanted to quickly walk through is that of the official language policy in Canada, to try to understand the way that these texts emerge from specific social context over a historical period. And I'll show that in the next few slides. So ultimately, when we're looking at a discursive approach to language policy, we're trying to understand how language is politicized and institutionalized in society. So looking at how language and debates about language, so language ideological debates, these are something that have been, comes from an edited collection from Jan Blommaert in 1999. And again, this was referenced by a previous speaker in the series. But how language and debates about language help to create the agenda for how language policy should emerge in the first place. So discussions about language, so discussions about the language policy context can result in a language policy itself. So trying to understand the way that discourse and texts that comprise that discourse can result and emerge, can both result in and emerge from a language policy context. So linguistic priorities that we talk about, that we foreground in our speech, can lead to the creation of discourse about language, but also we can consider that talk about language can also lead to the specific prioritization of specific linguistic subjects. So it can work both ways. Talk can lead to policy change, and policy change can lead to different ways of talking about language. And that's why we need to understand that talk about language is important as both the result and the origins of language policy. So in the next few slides, I'm going to try to highlight the role of discourse within a language policy cycle, drawing on the work of Michel Gazola, who I know was a previous speaker in the series as well. And he talks about how the language policy emerges because there is first the identification of a public problem that needs to be resolved. There is the study and definition of this problem that then turns to the formulation and comparison of different possible solutions. Step 4 be the choice of a solution. Step 5, the implementation. Step 6, the results of that implementation, then the evaluation of those results, and then step 8 being the return to the development or identification of future problems, because of course we know that problems evolve and emerge. Now, there are other ways of considering the language policy contexts. I mean, David Cassels-Johnson, for example, articulates this somewhat differently in his 2013 book. But the important thing is to recognize that there is a cycle and that there are different steps involved in language policy. So, I mean, Michel Gazola was referring here to the policy cycle, but of course this can be applied to language policy. But to recognize that text and discourse can fit within this cycle. So this is ultimately trying to map it onto a visual. Here is the same content that I've just shown you previously. So trying to relate this to the language policy context in Canada, just briefly for illustrative purposes to make it a little bit less abstract. In Canada, there was this period of tensions between Francophones and Anglophones in Canada that led to the Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, the B&B Commission in English. The reports of the commission led to the law, and then the law led to research and sort of the dissemination of results about the law. So trying to map this onto the policy cycle and more specifically how text and discourse relate to that policy cycle, we can see that in the first instance, we have these tensions, right, resulting from sort of conflict, and I won't go into too much detail here, it's not the subject of my talk, but tensions between Francophones and Anglophones. Those tensions tended to be expressed through different discursive acts, so written text, oral text. So there is a text manifestation of that first step of the policy cycle, right, looking at those lived tensions. So trying to understand the textual and discursive manifestation of each step in the policy, language policy cycle. That second step, looking at the creation of the B&B Commission. So there was a huge amount of textual research that was produced as a result of this. So participation and engagement of the general public through discourse, through testimonies. And so the work of Eve Hawke here is very relevant, and how she's gone through the archival research here on the B&B Commission, what was included in that final report and what wasn't. So the discursive and textual manifestation, that's step 2 in this policy cycle. So step 3, the reports of the commission are of course texts themselves that can be subject to text analysis. The language policy, okay, the Official Languages Act, right? We can look at that as a text. And step 5 being the research and dissemination of the results of the law. And those are, of course, media texts, scientific, academic research texts. So at every point, we can see that there are textual manifestations of this policy cycle, and discourse analysis can help us understand, not just enable us to examine these texts themselves, but also to theorize and explain the relationships of these texts to one another using theories like intertextuality. So to return back to the policy cycle, as I've tried to map here more generally, not just the Canadian language policy context. In step 1 of the policy cycle, we can look at historical texts where the original problem is identified. In step 2, we could look at how in terms of how the focus is being studied. So we could look at discourse from the general public. In step 3, if we're looking at the creation and comparison of different solutions, we could look at reports. Step 4 and 5, in terms of the choice of a solution and the implementation of that solution, we could look at different policy texts. And steps 6 and 7, looking at results of the policy and the evaluation of those results. Here, we could look at things like media texts and scientific and academic text research reports, which is what I've just mentioned is the result of what's happened in the Canadian context. So there are textual steps more generally that we can examine within a language policy context. Okay, so what I wanted to highlight here is the way that my research has fit within this policy cycle, as in how do I consider the work that I have done to fit within a discursive approach to language policy and within the language policy cycle. So in my own work, I have tended to look at discourses from the general public about language problems. So step 2, that relation to the policy cycle. And also I've looked at 6 and 7, I've looked at media representations of language policy contexts, and to a lesser extent, look at how this is represented within scientific and academic texts. Okay, so at this stage, I am going to quickly show you a few examples from my own research and how these relate to discourses of the general public and also media representations of the general public. Okay, so one of my earlier articles, I looked at how the Vancouver Olympics opening ceremonies were represented in English and French Canadian news, not just looking at the media representations of this language ideological debate, but also at comments on these news articles. So to give you a very brief bit of context, the Vancouver Olympics were held in 2010. And there was a comment from the Heritage Minister, James Moore, about whether or not there was enough French at those opening ceremonies. And to give you a little bit more context, French is not just one of Canada's official languages, but also one of the official languages of the Olympic, what's it called? The Olympic Committee. So that's not the exact name. In any case, so the comments from James Moore were reported on in the news and also met with a huge amount of backlash from Anglophones about whether or not there should be any role for French in the Vancouver Olympics. So I was very interested in how this the same event was represented in English and French, and how the comments on these reports might differ. And so I looked at these 4 data sets ultimately. So newspaper articles in English, newspaper articles in French, comments in French, comments in English on these newspaper articles, to show how these were represented in similar and different ways. And you can see that I'm still drawing on the notion of language ideology, these beliefs about language that tend to be manifested in very different ways through English and French. And this is the sort of main undercurrent of all of my research, to look at how English and French speaking Canadians, and that's not to the exclusion of bilinguals, I should say, but when language issues are represented in English and when they're represented in French, how these can differ in quite significant ways, thereby reproducing what's been called the 2 solitudes of Canada, right? The idea that the majority of English and French speaking Canadians don't just speak different languages, but understand the Canadian context in very different ways. So drawing on the work of Monica Heller, who draws on Hugh McLennan, and way back the work of Rilke. Okay, so I'll tell you a bit about the results when at the end of this very brief and rapid overview. Another context that I've looked at is what was called Pastegate. So there was, in 2013, the Office Québécois de la Langue Française went to an Italian restaurant on the basis of a complaint that was made about Italian words on a menu of an Italian restaurant instead of the French equivalent. And so those were words like the word pasta on the menu instead of the French form pâte, and bottiglia instead of bouteille, right? So what happened there was that the act of the Office Québécois de la Langue Française was re-semiotized, put into new semiosis or meaning-making forms through various social media platforms, and ended up being reported on internationally in a range of different languages. So in this case, I was especially interested in how the context was represented on Twitter. And I was especially interested in looking at the hashtag Pastegate as a non-English, non-French word with clear bias against the context, but to see how this similar hashtag could give rise to both English and French medium comments on this same issue. So again, I was interested in looking at a comparison of English and French data, but to try to give equal access to that context using a similar hashtag. So hashtags are another interest of mine because they can give rise to these sort of filter bubbles where we have access only to English data or French data. But in principle, on social media, we can actually try to overcome linguistic and geographic boundaries in ways that weren't previously possible with traditional, you might call, media. So again, looking at a language ideological debate, looking at the discourse of the general public, and looking at a comparison of English and French data. Another study that I have done is looking at traditional media. So using a large corpus of English and French Canadian print newspapers from 2009. I had 7.5 million words in English and 3 million words in French. I compared the way that languages were discussed in these print newspapers by journalists and commentators whose words were reported in the newspapers. So this was especially, the focus here was looking at the representation of official languages in Canada, using, so a different data type from the previous studies. And it was a bit more of a broad-based study without a focus on a language ideological debate. So in the first paper, it was the Vancouver Olympics. In the second paper, there was a focus on the Pastagate scandal. Here, I wanted to have a general baseline to understand how language issues are being discussed in Canada in general terms over a period when there was no heated language issue. More recently, and this is the last paper that I'll show you here, I have looked at language ideologies relating to nationalism in tweets about the 2019 Canadian general election. So here again, I was looking at tweets, and I found a hashtag that was used in both English and French to discuss the federal election. And again, I was interested to see how English and French Twitter users were using the same hashtag in different ways, and how that hashtag might relate to representations of official languages, but also other languages in the context of Indigenous language issues that were very much at the forefront. Well, at the forefront, they were gaining much more public attention and concern by the 2019 general election than they had been in previous years. So again, trying to establish a bit of a baseline using a different data set, Twitter, a more recent context, and again, the comparison of English and French. So you can see here, still looking at the discourse of the general public. So to very quickly summarize the kind of results that I've been finding across the studies that I have done, in English, I find that the English language is represented as having explicit instrumental value. So if English is discussed through the English language in the various data sets I've looked at, it tends to have instrumental value. So having really functional value in terms of its role as a communicative tool. When French is discussed through the medium of English in the various studies that I've found, again, there is this emphasis on instrumental value of English. There's almost no reference to the potential for French to have some kind of intrinsic identity-related value in French for French speakers, or even for English speakers or bilingual speakers. But what's interesting is that there tend to be representations of bilingualism as having some kind of intrinsic value relating to this notion of being Canadian, what makes Canadian different from American, of course, bilingualism, and these tropes about bilingualism. So having some kind of identity value for many English speaking Canadians speaking through the medium of English. So tend to be very explicitly represented. And of course, I'm speaking very generally here, and I could answer questions about this if you're interested when we meet. In French, the English language is represented as having instrumental value too, and this is made explicit. But also, there are representations of the French value of the French language having intrinsic value, and this is again made explicit in a lot of ways. There's not really a reference to the French language having as much instrumental or communicative or functional value in the context that I've looked at, but of course that could be subject to the fact that I've been looking at language ideological debates where this kind of thing might be glossed over in favor of sort of more heated issues that were raised in those contexts. And in French, when bilingualism is represented, it's represented as having a negative value. So not intrinsic, not instrumental, but dangerous and represented as having a negative effect on the ability to preserve and maintain the French language. So the methods that I've used have allowed me to focus specifically on explicit representations of language value, but there's a lot more that can be said about the implicit value of language and how these languages have potentially different representations in terms of what is going slightly unsaid. And one thing that I will leave you with is that because the English language tends to be discussed only when compared with other languages, it seems to me that there is simply no need for many English speakers in the data sets that I've looked at to raise the intrinsic value that English has for them, because it is rarely something that gives people pause for thought. Whereas in another paper that I haven't presented to you, when English was considered to be threatened by the rise of Chinese signage in Richmond, British Columbia, there was an increased representation of the intrinsic identity value of English for British Columbians in that context. So it's not to say that English doesn't have intrinsic value, but it is very interesting to me to see when these kind of values and beliefs about language are made explicit, which ones are made explicit and which ones remain implicit and why. Okay, so to leave you here, I want to conclude by saying that the discursive approach can present useful opportunities and perspectives for the language policy cycle. And that in the Canadian context, the analysis of texts and the relationship of texts to one another, so the discourse analysis of texts, can reveal results about the language policy context in a range of different Canadian contexts. And those are contexts where language policy is implemented and where language policy is evolving and can give rise to new problems, if we want to consider them like that, that need to be solved. So these contexts that I've looked at suggest to me that there can be that these contexts might be the source of eventual problems in a new language policy cycle. And specifically, the problem that I have continued to identify throughout the research is how very differently language policy, language issues are being represented in English and French. And this lack of consensus and understanding about what languages are and the roles that they serve for different language groups in Canada strikes me as the potential site for eventual reasons for a new language policy cycle. So with that, I will leave you and I look forward to speaking to you in person.